Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tristan Blythe, and I'm editor of Charity Finance magazine. We've got an interesting session ahead of us this morning, looking at the climate emergency and how faith charities can use their investments to respond to this. We're going to cover quite a lot of ground today. We have 4 different speakers in this session, and we're going to be taking questions from you throughout the next hour as each speaker finishes their presentation. So please make sure that you are putting the questions forward throughout, and I will put them to the speakers as we go. To begin with, I'm very pleased to say that we have the Reverend Canon Jennifer Smith with us, who is Superintendent Minister at Wesley's Chapel. Jennifer's going to give us a faith view on climate and responsibility to the planet. And as I say, as Jennifer's speaking, please do put questions for her so she can respond afterwards. But without any further ado, I will now hand over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Tristan, and good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's having a decent morning, and thank you for being here. I've been asked to just give one faith perspective about climate emergency and care for the planet, how we as charities can use our investments to address the emergency. And I'm really glad to see such a wide variety of charitable remits as well as faith perspectives represented. Because Christianity is not, thank goodness, the only faith with urgency about climate emergency. And David Palmer in a few minutes will give us a précis of some of the different faith responses in our context. And in many places, I want to say Christianity has been late to the table, especially amongst the Protestant and evangelical traditions, if I may name my own shortcomings. Now, I lead a large Methodist community in central London. We sit at a crossroads for theological questions coming from highly diverse economic and cultural settings. It's from that perspective that I want to say something about our theological method in response to climate emergency, and then a transition, I think, in the substance of our theology. Could we imagine an economy that did not rely on ecological degradation? As we take the down-to-earth, day-to-day decisions in our charities, as well as the more macro ones about our investment structure, we are already under great pressure. So first, method, then substance. Now, Methodists, and I'm a Methodist, I speak only for myself here, we tend to act first and then do our thinking afterwards. We're good, that means, at evolutionary change, at support, at service, keeping the show on the road. If someone's hungry, feed them. It's quite clear. The problem is that climate emergency is a situation where we need more than a friendly reverse theology. We need to expand our imagination, not just authorize our existing good instincts. A faith response to climate emergency needs to enliven and disturb our consciences, such that, and I'm going to use some old-fashioned language here, such that we are convicted in sin and can do nothing other than repent. Forgive the old-fashioned language, but I think its bite is appropriate. We need a prophetic edge to be called out and challenged beyond our gut reactions or indeed our pragmatic responses. So if we go back to Hebrew scripture, we have the example from Proverbs 3 of wisdom associated with Jesus, who stands at the crossroads and at the gates of the city and cries out a warning. Wisdom doesn't stand in the university or in the church or in the palace, but low to the ground at the crossroads in the marketplace. I have a sense of creation itself giving that warning today. So we need to do our theology from that prophetic crossroads, from the perspective of different places and constituencies. And I think that that's why fora like this are so important, because of your different areas of expertise and the bite of your approach as charitable trustees. It's good news because we have the competence to be able to do this work in this room. So that's a little bit about theological method. Substance, next. Now, I want to say it is still socially acceptable in many churches to start from the theological premise that says that the earth was given to humans to use for our benefit or to exploit for our profit. Or slightly softer, Some faith perspectives in Christianity would say humans are stewards of the planet and perhaps owe a better duty of care to it than we've exercised so far, but still keep that authoritative place. This kind of implicit theology has characterized much of our decision-making and our conservation efforts. It still does guide our responses to climate emergency in many places. Now, I want to draw a parallel. All through the 1700s, many so-called progressive slave owners had theology, scripture, and common sense to tell them that chattel slavery based on skin color was not only evil, but economically unsustainable. There was widespread theology demanding change, even and especially amongst slave owners. And yet, most could not imagine a way out of slavery, an economics that didn't depend on it. And thus were content to try to be better, more enlightened so-called masters. And I'm speaking here about men like Thomas Jefferson, also about my own New England ancestors. And a transition in theology was happening in which the position of the so-called benevolent master became untenable. I think a parallel theological transition is underway in regard to Christian approaches to climate emergency, a move away from the stewardship model of humanity and creation to something else. There are other and increasingly stronger theological voices, not new, but deeply seated within our tradition, as highlighted by Pope Francis' 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home, published incidentally on a day that's significant for Methodists, the 24th of May, the anniversary of John Wesley's conversion. In this document, there's a recovery of what we would call an integral theology. That is a vision of humanity as a neighbor in creation, integrated in ecological reality, not its mistress. Integral theology tells us that the change needed, and this is where I think the leather hits the pavement for charitable trustees, the change needed is not just about the restraint of a few large scapegoats, be they corporations or nations, but about the small-scale, down-to-earth behavior of all of us. An ethical response to climate emergency that has integrity with Christian theology will be worked out not just in our macroeconomics and in our investment choices, though it should be, but in the way I consume products and services, the way I build equity in my house if I have one, or buy clothing or source food. It's deeply personal, but never private. If we had more time, I would suggest that this leads us toward a Christian theology that steps away from affluence as a social good or a goal, and toward a model of abundance as a social good or goal, where affluence creates consumers and clients, abundance creates neighbors. There'd be more to say here, and you can pick it up if you want to. And in evangelical perspective, responses to the climate emergency are linked in the most fundamental way to who God is and what salvation means, and that's what we're about. Salvation in Jesus Christ is not just a lifeboat for a lucky few, but a promise of justice for all and integrity for creation. So I'll stop there, having made a comment about our method and given one perspective on the changing substance of our faith approaches in this. Again, in this room, there is great competence and experience and the breadth of faith approaches to this. We need them all to be able to address this emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. One quick question for you whilst we have you here. I was wondering whether you felt that this change that you've been speaking about should be, or indeed is, driven more by the faith leaders or by the followers, or perhaps in the case of the workers within charities?
Well, I hope both. If I go back to the model of wisdom in Proverbs 3, again, it's really important that this is a voice which is an irritant, an annoyance even. I remember once talking to a bishop in another part of the world who called me a mosquito, that the noise you have like around in your head that won't go away. I think our prophetic challenge about climate emergency needs to be like that, from the ground up, but also from the top down. I think it's got to come from both places.
Okay. And Also, I was wondering whether perhaps, I know David's going to speak shortly about the different views, but whether there's much, in your experience, interfaith work. We've got, as you said, lots of faiths watching today, lots of charities from different backgrounds. How you see that interaction taking place? I
think we could do better. And I think we could absolutely do better, especially as we support our local faith communities. I'm the chair of trustees of a large religious charity with investments, so that's how I come to this conversation. But I'm also a week-by-week pastor for people who live in real homes and are trying to do real jobs and get by. And I think there's interfaith work to be done, both, again, at the macro level and also just in our communities, the way that we make our streets more habitable places. I think about some of the interfaith initiatives, for instance, in Lozells or in Handsworth in Birmingham, picking rubbish or just making safer sanctuary spaces in streets. I think this is how it begins.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that, Jen. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to come back to you with future questions. But thank you for now.
Sure.
Very much appreciate your contribution. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the second part of the presentation, which is going to come from David Palmer, who is Chief Executive of Epworth Investments, a role he's held since 2017. And David is going to speak on are all faith groups on the same page when it comes to this climate emergency. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Tristan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, a quick shout out to the civil society who made this week possible, Faith Forum Week. We were part of the Faith Forum last year, a great success. We made many friends there. Let's particularly thank Jenny O'Donovan, who's worked very hard with 2 one-year-old children to make this week work. So thank you, Jenny. You just heard from Jen about the Bible's take on humankind's responsibilities to God's planet. Jen, as you've heard, is from Wesley's Chapel, a few hundred yards up from our office on Bonhill Street. She comes into office every Tuesday to lead prayers. So we're grateful for her help and her support for us in Epworth. Most of you who were here last year will know that Epworth is actually part of the Methodist Church. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Central Finance Board of the Methodist Church. Now, the CFB looks after the church's assets, and Epworth the assets of other churches and charities. For all of our clients, we use the same Christian ethical approach. We have a committee that's been in place for over 40 years now that drives our ethics. You'll hear from Mark shortly about the Epworth Climate Stewardship Fund. That word stewardship of our planet is a consistent theme across all of the world's faiths. And my job in the next few minutes to take you on a quick journey on how some of the world's faiths view the climate emergency. Please forgive me in advance for my very poor pronunciation of some very important concepts. Slide, please. In 2015, leaders of the Islamic faith reminded the world's Muslims that mankind is a caretaker or steward of our planet. Khalifa means leader. Slide again, please. And again. Thank you. Khalifa means leader. It also means steward. The Islamic Declaration called upon the people of all nations and their leaders to commit themselves to renewable energy and a zero-emission strategy as early as possible. They said that the current rate of climate change cannot be sustained and the Earth's fine equilibrium may soon be lost. They also called upon well-off countries to turn away from unethical profit from the environment. Slide, please. Christian faith, the Catholic Church, has long recognized the climate emergency. Bishop Grimaldi, then Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, gave an address on the 10 Commandments for the environment all the way back in 2005. Pope Francis has issued 2 encyclicals. Those are letters to all bishops in the Catholic Church. The first one he wrote jointly with Pope Benedict, called Lumen Fidel, the light of faith. The second one was Laudato Si, an ecological plea subtitled On Care for Our Common Home. This encyclical, Pope Francis called for honesty, courage, and responsibility to reduce greenhouse gases. And of course, last year, Pope Francis joined many faiths in declaring the climate emergency. Slide, please. The 2015 COP meeting in Paris led to many faiths looking at the climate emergency. The Hindu faith made its second declaration on climate change, called Bhumi Devi Kai Jai, or Long Live Mother Earth. This declaration acknowledged the pain and suffering caused by how we use the land and its natural resources. Slide, please. At the same time, the Sikh faith, through EcoSikh, appealed for lawmakers, faith leaders, and citizens of the world to take concrete action towards reducing carbon emissions and protecting the environment. For Sikhism, Mother Earth, Mata Dharat, has always been a key concept. Slide, please. The Jewish faith has the concept of Tikkun Olam, of repair the world. For many Jews, this evokes the need to serve. Many interpret it as a requirement to do impact investing, to avoid investment in things that harm God's kingdom. As a man of faith, I'm greatly encouraged when I see such a united position from all the world's major faiths. As an ethical investor at Epworth, we judge our performance not just on our investment returns, but also our ethical outcomes. As I said last year, I have no doubt that our ethical performance is improved when we all work together. Our voice is stronger and louder from the faith community when we all speak with one voice. So, what does this commitment to God's planet, to Mother Earth, mean in the investment world? Like many of the complex issues we all face, there is no easy answer. In the last year, we've seen a tremendous push by campaigners to avoid investment in fossil fuel companies. But what do we really mean by this? It'd be very hard to find any company that doesn't use fossil fuels in some way. Could be in their raw materials, in their finished products, the shipping of those by air, land, or sea. Maybe it's part of the chemical makeup. Maybe it's just in the heating and air conditioning in their offices. Fossil fuel companies are an easy target. They are a very visible source of carbon emissions, and the world is slowly moving to a place where we need less of them. But for now, we do still need some of them. Slide, please. One of my favorite websites shows the National Grid's power source. You can go in there anytime, go in there now, and you can see where right now the UK gets its power from. I did this screenshot back in August. You can see from this where, on that day in August, at that particular time, where the UK is getting its power from. The box in the middle in green is green energies. And you can see that on this particular day, solar was 16.4% of the UK's energy needs, wind 3.8. Top right in blue, nuclear 9.5. But look, in the red box there, over half of the UK's energy was still coming from fossil fuels, even on a hot day in August. It's the UK, not so hot. So fossil fuels still have a role in our economy. The next chart, please, shows a transition in energy sources to get the world from where we are today to where we need to be to meet the Paris Accord. So you can see decade by decade here, the mix of energy and uses. The columns in black and red, those are coal and oil. So you'll see that even by 2050, we still have some use for those energy sources. We do have alternatives growing in green there and in orange. And the important thing is here is the use of transitionary fuels, gas and nuclear. I say that last one with biting my tongue, because I used to campaign for CND on the streets in the 70s. And relying upon nuclear power is a compromise that we're going to have to bear. So there's no simple be in or be out of oil and gas debate. It's more choose your energy sources wisely. Avoid the highest carbon producing fuels. So for many investors, that means avoiding thermal coal, tar sands. Given the path I'm showing you here, is there a need for new oil sources? Unlikely, so therefore avoid oil exploration companies. But now we get into the heart of the matter, the ethical debate of profiting from companies whose main product does harm to our world. For many faith investors, this is the real issue. Not are these companies aligned with Paris or not, but rather it is sinful to be profiting from their activities in the same way as other sin stocks, such as gambling and pornography and weapons platforms, should be avoided. In the UK, the Christian faiths are on this journey, from the pragmatic view of the fossil fuels, that they're necessary evil, to one where many Christians see them as a sin stock. Slide, please. At Epworth, we've been watching different attitudes of churches in the UK over the last few years. Here you see a quick summary. Hope it's up to date. Forgive me if it's not quite up to date. The Quakers, of course, I know some of you are here, were the first on this journey. Disinvesting from oil and gas back in 2015. Now, the Reformed Church is out of oil and gas this summer. Our own Methodist Church is out of most oil and gas companies, but not all. Debate we're still having within the church. Other churches, are still not investing in tar sands and coal, but do hold the oil majors. However, it's not just about the supply side of the fossil fuel debate. At Epworth, we also focus upon then users of the products. Utility companies that power the national grid, for example. And Christophe will talk about those more shortly. We also look at companies that emit high levels of greenhouse gases through their activities. Let me give you just one example of an industry. About 4 billion tons of cement are made every year, a key component, of course, of concrete, used throughout the world by the construction industry. A crucial step in the manufacture of cement is the calcination of limestone, sits under a very high temperature. Now, the reaction itself to make limestone throws off CO2. And the fossil fuels need to heat the limestone, greenhouse gases. Put these together, and the cement industry accounts for 80% of the world's greenhouse gases every year. One projection has the floor area of the world's buildings doubling in the next 40 years. To solve the climate emergency, we desperately need a cheap alternative to cement. So we're talking to you, not just investors in companies to contribute to the climate emergency, but also as creators of greenhouse gases ourselves. As churches, we need to think about how to heat our places of worship. Do we insulate them properly? How do people move around between our congregations? It seems immoral to me to call oil and gas companies sin stocks, then not do our best to minimize our use of their products. One of the few positives from this lockdown, apart from me wearing a suit today for the first time, is the decline in the number of physical meetings. We had our AGM back in April, and usually turgid affair, very poorly attended. The Zoom call had the best attendance ever, and leaders of our church were in attendance. We had no travel costs, environmental or monetary, so having benefits from this lockdown. While I have the audience, I want to make a quick aside on global levels of greenhouse gases. Many politicians will point to massive carbon emissions that are being produced today by the developing world. And it's true that they tend to use accessible fuel sources and cheaper technologies that are more carbon producing. Here's the latest data we've got. Thank you. Slide, please. So back in 2017, latest data, the biggest two emitters in the world of greenhouse gases were China and India. No surprise to see the USA in second place. Sorry, Jen. By the way, if the cement industry was on this list, it'd be the third biggest country emitter. Now, this chart suggests that Europe is actually a relatively minor contributor to the world's carbon footprint. But this chart ignores how Europe got to be where it is today. Look at this chart instead. Slide, please. This is cumulative emissions since 1751. Yellow is the EU. So when it all started, of course, only the EU were emitting at the start of our Industrial Revolution. The US really didn't start emitting until the turn of the 20th century, and then not until 1950, really. If you look at all greenhouse gases emissions since 1751, the US is top with 25%. EU is second with 22%. In contrast, India, in its history, has given us 3% of the world's total emissions, the same as the whole of Africa, which South Africa is actually half. So for these nations to become developed countries, they'll have to use the resources that are cheapest and most accessible. It is solar power, but many of them also have coal, for example. Now, why shouldn't they have a carbon budget similar to that of Europe and the USA to get to where they are today? And here we have one of the great ethical dilemmas we all face. It's the conflict between helping the world's poorest get out of their poverty trap versus the damage it does to God's planet. There are no easy answers. I'm sure all of you in this conference recognize our commitment to support God's kingdom, but the damage that's been done to it by the climate emergency. I've tried to describe briefly how different faiths look at this and difficult investment decisions, difficult outcomes we have to face up to. I'm very pleased to say I have no answers. For those, I'm going to hand you across to my colleagues now, Christophe and Mark. Thank you.
Thanks very much there, David. One quick question for you whilst you have the podium. You mentioned, obviously, there's lots of divestment going on across, particularly the Christian charities you highlighted. And you said perhaps that there's, it's not quite as simple as that. But do you see that maybe as people's first step as they get used to the idea of investing in a responsible way generally, but particularly with regards to climate?
Yeah, I think we all recognise the climate emergency. I recently was part of a debate where the debate was about, is there a climate emergency? Well, there isn't. We all know there is a serious one. How do you best address it? And there are easy targets and harder targets. I mentioned fossil fuel companies, easy disinvestment to make. Once you're out of them, you lose the voice you have in those companies. we file resolutions at Shell asking them to be more transparent on their Scope 3 emissions, for example, tying the CEO's bonus to their Scope 3 emissions. If we lose that voice in the boardroom, we lose that ability. So for me, it's not a simple disinvest or not. It's not just being oil or gas or not. It's a far more complex issue. I mentioned the cement industry desperately need to bring their emissions down. So it's a very complex issue. We all agree we have to resolve it. Where we don't always agree is how we go about doing that.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, David, for that. As I'm sure we'll come back to you in future questions, but thank you for your time and your presentation. So we're now going to move on to Christophe Borysiewicz, who is Head of Investments at Epworth, who's going to give us challenges in investing in response to the climate emergency. So Christophe, over to you, please.
Thank you. It sounds so easy, doesn't it? You discuss it among the trustees, the finance committee chunter a bit, but they're willing to go along with the idea. So you phone up your investment manager and tell them the news. We want to sell our oil and gas holdings. They're destroying the planet. Your investment manager thanks you graciously for the phone call. We're a polite bunch, by and large. They say, yes, absolutely. The phone call's going well. But then they start to ask you questions. More questions and even more questions. How do you define an oil and gas company? What about the users of oil and gas? Are you content with the impact on the risk profile of your portfolio? When we reinvest the proceeds, what do you want us to focus on? Do you want more renewables in your portfolio? To go back a step or two and introduce myself properly, I'm Christophe Borysiewicz, the Head of Investment Management at Epworth Investment Management and the Central Finance Board of the Methodist Church. And one of the best parts of my job is exploring questions like these with our clients. Sometimes they're questions about the trade-offs between risk and return. Sometimes they're questions about the trade-offs between investment goals and a charity's financial circumstances. And sometimes they're questions like today's about ethical investment and what ethical investment means when you get down to the nitty-gritty of applying a seemingly straightforward ethical policy to a real portfolio. Now, my colleague Mark will talk a bit later about what we heard from our clients when we discussed these questions with them. But before he does that, I'd like to explore with you some of the questions and implications of disinvesting from fossil fuels. So, if we turn to the slide, we'll start with the very first question. You want to sell your shares in oil companies. How are you defining an oil company? It sounds like an odd question. And the easiest of the replies might be something along the lines of, well, BP and Shell are oil companies, and we don't want to be invested in that kind of thing. But most investment managers use some kind of screening process when applying ethical investment policies, and they'll want to know what to apply. Is a fossil fuel company one which gets more than 50% of its revenues from oil and gas? Or should the limit be 20%? Or 10%? Or 5%? Or even anything above zero? That isn't just a theoretical question. Take, for example, a company like SSE, the old Scottish Hydro, one of the UK's leading investors in renewable energy. Last year, it invested £340 million in renewables and nearly £1 billion in the distribution and transmission networks for electricity as these evolve to meet the challenges of net zero. Yet, it also sells gas to its customers. People like you and me, who have gas boilers and gas hobs in our homes. And to balance some of the risks in that, it's historically had interests in natural gas fields in the North Sea. Last year, 5.1% of its operating profits came from gas production. How much is too much? We know that we live in an imperfect world and that no companies are perfect. Where to draw the line between a company which is imperfect and in which we're not willing to invest, and a company which is imperfect yet in which we are willing to invest? It's one of the hardest questions in ethical investment. On to our next question, and indeed our next slide. What then about the users of fossil fuels? David spoke earlier about the cement industry and the immense amount of greenhouse gas emissions it spews out. You can see the 10 largest emitters listed on global stock markets. That's companies in which you can invest. The top company is indeed an oil and gas company, China Petroleum and Chemical. But only 3 of the top 10 listed emitters are actually oil and gas companies. 3 are chemical companies, 3 are steel companies, 3 are utilities, and 1's a cement company. All industries which can be very intensive users of fossil fuels. But why does that matter? Well, imagine the scenario. You sell your BP, Shell, and Anglo-American holdings because of concerns about climate change. And you invest the proceeds in British Airways, CRH, and RWE. Companies with very high carbon footprints. It doesn't feel quite right, does it? If ever there were an issue to demonstrate the complexities of ethical investment, this might be it. All companies are in some way users of fossil fuels. So we're back to that same issue as earlier. Where do you draw the line in a world in which we're all complicit in the structural sin of climate change? So you've dealt with the tricky definitional questions. Phew. Your investment manager can now produce a list of companies which are excluded from your portfolio. Perhaps the likes of BP, Shell, or Anglo-American. Maybe IAG, the owner of British Airways, or CRH in the UK. Perhaps ExxonMobil, Chevron, Total, on a more global basis. What kind of impact is that going to have on your investment portfolio? Well, it depends where you invest. If we look at this next slide, we all know that oil and gas companies have had a terrible 2020 in terms of share price performance, but they still form large parts of stock markets. If you were based in Portugal, Poland, or Austria, it would still be over 20%, according to the FTSE All World Index. More domestically in the UK, it's still 10%, down from nearly 15% a couple of years ago, though less globally. If you've had oil and gas companies in your portfolios, then you'll know they've not been universally terrible investments, despite the last 12 months. They've been there for a reason. If we move on to the next slide, that leads me to paraphrase a film vaguely about faith, if you'll forgive me. What have oil and gas companies ever done for us? It's a question we need to answer if we want to understand what the implications of removing oil and gas companies from portfolios is, and if we want to grapple with what to replace them as we build new portfolios without them. Historically, there was one elephant in the room on this subject, which we'll go on to later. But first, 3 less well-known issues. The first is liquidity. Some of you might represent endowments which can never be spent and have a theoretical holding time of forever. Others might have portfolios which exist to support operations and where the ability to access the capital is more important. That ability, or liquidity as we call it, can be very important. Just look at the recent Woodford saga. BP and Shell are two of the largest and most liquid companies listed on stock markets. Last week, on average, £95 million worth of BP shares traded every day. For Shell, the daily volume was nearer £125 million worth. The second issue is tracking error. That's jargon for how far your portfolio's return is different from the overall stock market. We're all happy to do much better than other investors in good times. But how much worse are we willing to do in bad times? Oil company shares have performed poorly in the last few months, but just imagine they doubled in October. Would we be willing to underperform other investors by 10%? At Epworth, we have a long track record of investing ethically and have monitored the impact of the Methodist Church's ethical stance over the last couple of decades. I can report that over 18 years to the end of June, the basket of stocks which we view as ethically acceptable returned 6.03% a year, while the overall stock market, the FTSE All-Share, returned 5.99%. Ethics is marginally positive to investment performance. It sounds like an investment manager's dream. But hidden within that overall data series are some very good years, like 2018, when tobacco companies' share prices halved. But also some very bad years, such as 2007 or 2016. When we exclude large oil companies, our divergence from other investors will only grow. The third thing which oil and gas companies have done for us is that, with the massive exception of this year, they've been defensive during downturns. This century's seen two great bear markets. On both occasions, while BP and Shell shares fell, it was by significantly less than the overall stock market. I mentioned the elephant in the room later. It's on the next slide. That had always been income. Many charities were and are dependent on investment income to undertake their charitable objectives. If we skip to the next slide. According to the Linked Dividend Monitor in 2019, oil and gas companies provided 18% of overall stock market income, with mining companies providing a further 11%. Historically, selling out of fossil fuel companies meant being worried about taking a hit to investment income. But this year's been different. And on that slide, you can see the impact of that. If you looked back to the decade to June 2010, most fossil fuel companies outperformed the stock market, and in some cases, very significantly so. If you look at the decade to June 2020, the story is very different. The collapse in oil prices this spring led to sharp share price falls and to oil companies cutting their dividends, BP in half and Shell by 2/3. However, the yield data on that slide is after the impact of the cuts. Even now, these companies still provide a good dividend yield. So we've thought a little bit about what fossil fuel producers have ever done for investors' portfolios. So we can also think about how we want our portfolios to look as we start again without them, and what we should replace them with. And as you've probably guessed by now, that means grappling with those questions from earlier. How important is income to us? Is liquidity important or not? Are we worried if our portfolios deviate significantly from the market? Do we want our portfolios to be defensive during downturns? They're all questions that we need to think about as we build our portfolios without fossil fuel producers? But these are also questions which you've hopefully all discussed with your investment managers already. Selling the fossil fuel producers in your portfolio raises one extra question. Should you reinvest the proceeds in renewable energy? Instead of financing global warming, you could finance the transition to a greener economy. It's a very appealing idea, but we need to dig deeper into it for a number of reasons. The first one, sadly again, is a definitional question. What do you mean by investing in renewable energy? If we move forward a couple of slides. Is it investing in operational assets like wind farms? Is it investing in technology or engineering companies like solar panel producers? The two have got very different risk characteristics. Qcells, a German company which a few years before had been the world's biggest maker of solar panels, filed for bankruptcy in April 2012. A reminder that not all companies in growth industries provide growth. So what of investing in wind or solar farms? Many of you will know of vehicles like Greencoat UK Wind or the Renewables Infrastructure Group, which invest in these assets, provide good income and relatively stable share prices. These are relatively new concepts, with the earliest listing only dating back to 2013, though they've performed reasonably well so far. Perhaps the question with these isn't should we invest in them, but how much of our portfolio is it appropriate to have invested in them? And the answer to that question will depend on so many more of the other questions that you discuss with your investment managers. And just in case you've had enough of all these questions, Mark O'Connor will report on what we well learned as we discussed all of these questions and many more with our clients last year.
Okay, thank you very much, Christophe. Just a question for you whilst we have you there. I speak to a number of charities in the market and indeed look at the investment management market, and one of the concerns that people have when trying to adopt this approach is so-called greenwashing. So, confusing terms being used. Is this product really an ethical investment? Is it really climate change friendly? I was wondering if perhaps you had any big red warning flags or perhaps 2 or 3 questions that people should ask to reassure themselves, because I know most firms out there are trying to do the right thing, but whether there's anything you could give them guidance on.
You should always dig deeper, is really it. It's very easy to say, oh, this is a climate-friendly solution. And as a climate-friendly solution, we do X, Y, Z. And it's not so much this is the one question you should ask, it's that you should ask lots of questions. I'd say, do you invest in oil and gas companies? Are you worried about heavy users of emitters? Do you have any positive investments? Issues like that. And then always follow up those questions a bit more.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. And just one more thing. You spoke briefly about the income and the questions around that. Obviously, over the past few months with lockdown, lots of charities have seen lots of their income streams cut off. Hopefully we'll see them coming back on, but it's still a very uncertain time. So perhaps investment income is even more important. So do you think now for anyone who hasn't adopted this approach, that's a barrier under the current circumstances, or should it be something that pushes them on?
I would say that might almost be something that Mark's about to cover in his talk.
Well, that's a very nice segue. So I think, thank you. We'll leave it there and we will move on to Mark in that case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So yes, up next we have Mark O'Connor, who is Head of Business Development at Epworth. He's going to be talking about the Stewardship Fund, as Christophe's already set him up quite nicely. I'll hand over straight over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Tristan. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. I have to say we're starting to feel a little bit lonely this end at the lack of questions. So if you are out there and you have any thoughts, please don't be shy, and because we'd be delighted to take questions. So David has talked a little bit about the journey that Fate Charities have been on, and Christophe has taken you through some of the challenges. That might have your head spinning a little there, because there is a lot to go through. What I'm going to do is present the solution that we came up with, the Epworth Climate Stewardship Fund. And when I say we, I really mean our clients. As Christophe mentioned, we spend a lot of time with our clients working on these issues. What are the trade-offs? What will work? What won't work? To try and come up with a fund that would be a suitable climate solution for all UK charities. So if we maybe go on to the first slide, and then skip one again. Right. Now, if this isn't the dullest slide of the day, then the other speakers have a lot to answer for. But it's important because Epworth, we are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, and the investment fund I'm talking about is a long-term investment, and the value of investments can go down as well as up. So it's important that we just cover that straight off. So if we go into the presentation proper on the next slide, what's the aim of the fund? Well, you can see it up there on the screen. It has two aims. One is to help UK charities tackle the climate emergency, and the second is to try and produce good long-term returns. Both of those have to go in hand for this to be an effective solution for UK charities. If you could move on. So what do we really mean by that? We want good returns, and so the measurements we have is we want to outperform the market. And we define the market as the FTSE All Share Index. And we're looking to do that net of all fees. And then looking at more the climate side, we say we want to have a lower carbon intensity, and that must be at least 15% lower than the market. Now, where did we get that number? Again, it was actually in conversations with the regulator. We were going to go with things with significant, substantial, and they said, yeah, well, what does that actually mean? You've got to give us a number. So we've put in at least 15%. Now, we're hoping to do much better than that, and I'll come back to where we are at the end of the presentation. So if we roll on. So this is really the fund in a nutshell, what it does. We deliberately exclude certain companies. We then also look for companies that we think will help the transition to a lower carbon economy. And finally, we engage with portfolio companies, and that is a very important part of what we do. Now, what I'm going to do is go into each of those in just a little bit more detail. Have the next slide. So firstly, what's out? Well, in some ways, it's the obvious candidates. Everyone would mention them, Shell and BP. We won't invest in oil and gas stocks. But we also exclude investments in companies that service those in a significant way. You have Rotork. I'll be honest, I didn't know what Rotork did till I looked it up the other day. But it has devices which manages the flow of oils, gas, liquid, things of that nature. So they're very much a supplier to the oil and gas. That comes out. But one thing our clients were very keen on was this situation that you don't come out of oil and gas and then put your capital to work in other companies which may seem more friendly, but are still causing a lot of damage to the environment. So we went beyond fossil fuels, and we will take out some of the biggest greenhouse gas producers. So again, CRH, the cement company that was mentioned earlier, and Rio Tinto would be two stocks we would exclude on that basis. And then finally, as with all our portfolios, it follows a Christian ethical approach. So we won't invest in what we call the sin stocks, as were alcohol, tobacco. And again, I've got a couple of examples on screen. So these are deliberate exclusions that we take out. And it's a much more complex and hopefully a much more holistic solution than just selling BP and Shell. So if we go on to the next slide. Now, when we talk about stocks transitioning to the lower carbon economy, this generally is windmills, wind farms. People think of that sort of thing. But there's actually a lot of really good companies. First of all, nothing goes in our portfolio unless we think it is a good sustainable company with good management and good prospects. But we also try to look for those that we think are helping with the carbon transition. This could be a household name like Unilever, which has very ambitious targets to cut the impact of its products. Or DS Smith, maybe less familiar, but it's a packaging company that is aiming to use 100% recycled materials. We like those characteristics. In addition to being good, solid investments, they're doing the right thing. So what we will do in this fund is put more capital to work in those types of stocks. And if we go into the final part, I say it's last, but certainly not least. Engaging is at the core of what we do at Epworth. So we will engage with companies on a wide range of issues, anything from modern slavery, executive remuneration, and of course, climate change is a very important one. Now, we do this ourselves, but we also work with other groups, and you'll see some of those listed on the slide. There's lots of other organizations that they're the most common ones we work with. Now, when you work together, you tend to have a stronger voice. And I think that can be seen in the case study I'd like to touch on. So Barclays, everyone will know, we co-filed a resolution with a firm called ShareAction and some other investment managers. And we were trying to get them to encourage Barclays to withdraw its financial services to those parts of the energy sector who weren't aligned with the Paris Accord. Now, the reaction to that from Barclays was good in that whilst they didn't like that resolution, they came out with one of their own, pledging to a net zero emissions target by 2050. Now, that wasn't everything we wanted. Both resolutions went to shareholders. Our resolution got 24%, so it wasn't carried, but the Barclays one was carried. And what it's done, it means every time we talk to Barclays now, we have a benchmark to mention them. We can hold up a mirror and say, you said you were going to do this. What's your progress to it? But there's a wider benefit than that. We then can go to other financial services institutions and banks like Barclays and say, look, Barclays is doing this. Why aren't you doing at least as much? So it's about improving standards across all the portfolio, stock by stock by stock, making them all more climate aware. That's how we'll be successful. So I'd like to go back to now to sort of the basics of this. You go on to the next slide. It's on performance. This is an investment fund. You invest in it to get good returns. But what do we mean by that? And what can you expect? I should say straight off, obviously, on performance, there are no guarantees. As I said, things go down as well as up. But what are we trying to achieve? Well, outperformance, we're looking to do better than the market, which we define as the FTSE All-Share. Now, the fund itself was launched in May this year. And as some of you will know, there's some fairly tight rules about how we can promote our performance. I can say that it has started well, but we can't officially report the performance until it has 12 months of operation. So as a guide, the fund that is probably closest to this would be our UK equity fund. And again, while they share an awful lot of the same stocks, there will be differences. But if you looked at the performance profile of that fund over 1, 3, 5, and 10 years, which you can find on the Epworth website, you'll see that, yes, it's a little over market over every time period after fees. And it might seem a little unusual for a fund manager, but we don't target being the best performing fund manager. What we try to do is give you stable, consistent market plus returns, net of fees, whilst ensuring that your ethics are both protected and promoted through your investments. So if you want great ethics and great performance, that's what we're looking to do. Sometimes we will be the top performing manager, but it's not our focus. It's about doing a very careful job of giving you good returns and getting the ethics right for you. So if we could move to our final slide. So it's an investment fund, but it also has to have a climate outcome. If there isn't one, then there's not much point to it. And I'm pleased to say the investment team did some work for me ahead of this event as to exactly where the fund was. So roughly about a week ago, the carbon intensity of the fund is 64% lower than the FTSE All-Share. Now that's hopefully, even the regulator would agree, that's a hugely significant number. So what I hope is you can see we have a fund here that's a lot of UK charities have contributed to, and their time and energy has allowed us to shape something which should really help you to meet your climate concerns and should also target good long-term returns. Now, in terms of the fund, I was delighted to take any questions now, but of course my details are on the Faith Week website. I think Christophe is on there as well. And we're also on the Epworth website. So if after this you'd like to have a one-on-one chat or set up a meeting, then please do so. But right now, me and the team would be happy to take any questions that you may have. It would be nice to get one.
Thanks, Mark. We've actually had a couple come in, so I will put them to you. One is, I think, more related to your part of the presentation. So I'll start with that one, if I may, which is you mentioned, obviously, your conversations with Barclays as a case study. But the question that's been asked is how strongly or cautiously have financial institutions responded to the ethical questions you've raised, and how easy has it been to start those discussions with them?
I don't get, Tristan, I'll start it off, but I don't get directly involved in the ethical interaction. I will ask Christophe to maybe, or David to offer a comment on that. But there is a lot, it's a lot more than us. Obviously, we're part of the Church Investors Group, which is quite a powerful body. We work with Share Action. I don't think there's very many organizations out there who don't take climate change seriously, or at least know that the perception of not doing it would be very negative for them. So in terms of having dialogue, I think we find that we're able to have good dialogue. Do companies always react in the way we would want? Not maybe necessarily. You'll see in the Barclays case, we took a position which then made them come up with their own position. So the question would be, I guess cynically, would Barclays have done anything if we hadn't proposed a resolution? And maybe they would have. Let's be positive. Maybe they would have. But it's our job to basically hold up the mirror and keep asking the questions and improving standards, with all companies we come across. But David or Christophe, would you like to add anything? Christophe, please.
So engagement's a funny thing. You never quite know how much impact you've had. Sometimes a company is very pleasant to you and very listening and doesn't change. And sometimes a company seems quite brusque as they deal with you, but then a year later you notice something a bit different. Companies are ultimately run by people, and engagements are with people as well as companies. So universally, it's very hard to talk about a universal trend among institutions.
Okay, thank you, Christophe. I've got a slightly broader question that's also come in, if you wouldn't mind tackling this one. And it's a question about how charities can work together to use their combined resources to invest their capitals, to generate incomes and find a way of raising capital to cope with the challenges of COVID under this environment. Is there anything you could perhaps give us on that side of things?
Well, I'm not sure we have necessarily a COVID solution, as it were. What we've been trying to do as a house, as it were, an investment manager, we have a cash product which pays an interest rate. So we have seen charities come to us because the interest rate, because we've pooled together with charities, we've been supporting the rate. So some people have come to us during that period for that. Specifically on how they could pool together on COVID, I think it's one we might need to have a little bit more thought on. But what I would suggest is that person, if they have something specific in mind, if they could perhaps email me, and maybe after the event, I'll get in touch with them and see if we can explore something in a little more detail.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. And then I think we've probably got time for one more question, which has actually come in for Jennifer, which is, given that divesting from fossil fuel companies may have an impact on returns, from your perspective, how far do you feel comfortable sacrificing returns given the obvious moral imperative?
I think that's a really good question, and thank you to the person who asked it. Because this money doesn't belong to us, and I'm just so conscious that because I'm a minister of a congregation that, as well as its congregational life, is doing a number of different social outreach and community development works, all of which are terrifically important and never more than right now. We do need that return. But this money is made up of £5 and £1 and small contributions which have been given by people over years and all over the country. And so my calculation about this question about when to jump and how much return is allowable to sacrifice has to do with trying to imagine the integrity of the people who've given that money over time and imagine their goals. My answer, I think, would be that it's a bit of an art where sometimes we only know afterwards. And our trustees have very lively conversations about those questions. What I would say is, as someone who sits in leadership to facilitate that conversation within an organization, conflict is good, not toxic conflict, but intelligent, informed conflict, which draws out the nuance of the conversation and is willing to change its mind. Because the answer to that question about how much return can we sacrifice, the answer today may not be the same as the answer tomorrow. So we need to sit very humbly, again, with the integrity of our first donors and givers, with the imperatives in the context that we see around us, and with allowable conflict, healthy conflict within our organizations.
Tristan, can I just pick up on that? Obviously, there will be some difference in returns. If you're not in certain stocks, they're going to perform better or worse than what you're in, etc. But this fund is a genuine attempt to try and have this climate effect, but still give returns that are above the market. Like I said, we can't promise that. But as Christophe mentioned in his talk, the Methodist Church numbers going back for a long time. Now, most of those, they will include when we haven't had a lot of oil and gas stocks. We've had some in there and some were out. But when you looked at the ethical, we're slightly ahead of the market over that long time period. So I think there's a new challenge. The ethical investment is no longer about that, you can invest and it's okay to be a few percentage points behind the market. Most charity trustees just will not wear that. So I think this solution and other solutions have to deliver both on the ethics and the performance. That's the investment manager's job. And going back to, what questions should you ask your investment manager? It's how are they going to do that? If, like I said, we wouldn't be looking to outperform the market by significant amounts every year. What we're hoping to do is over the long term to be a little bit ahead of it, net of fees, but you've got that ethical content. So I think people shouldn't fear ethics if they can have ethics and returns. It may not be the top return at any particular time, but that's the profile. You can have both. So you can have your cake and eat it, as it were.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Mark. Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to draw things to a close as our time is up. But I'd just like to thank David, Christophe, Mark and Jennifer for their contributions this morning. Lots of thought-provoking and practical stuff there. And thank you all for watching and your questions and taking part today. As Mark said, if you have any other questions, his contact details are available. Please do get in touch with the team at Epworth. And also enjoy the rest of the sessions as part of this week. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.